Hi everyone, welcome to another Emotions Debrief video. My name is Indiveri De Silva and I am the current coach of Muses College and former debater from Ladies College. So today I will be debriefing the semi-final motion from the Dr. Stanley Abeysekara Memorial Debating Championship of 2024. So the motion reads, this house believes that it is in the interest of India to abandon strategic ambiguity in international relations. So firstly, when it comes to this house, understand that this house believes that motion, which means that you're not going to be debating on whether India is likely to or would end up becoming not becoming strategically ambiguous, but this debate is rather about, given the benefits that you would achieve of maybe not being strategically ambiguous or being strategically ambiguous, this is what India should ideally do. So when it comes to the motion or the idea of strategic ambiguity, the Infoslide gives us a rough idea of how this is like a form of non-alliance where you don't you take an ambiguous stance in certain international relations, which means like international crises like the Ukraine-Russia war, or like trade wars between like US and China, or maybe like weapons dealing between like USSR and US, especially during like the Cold War and things like that. So we have a rough understanding of what strategic ambiguity generally looks like. So the question here is about how basically either side has to prove what exactly is the best interest of India at this point of time, and why can that best interest be achieved through having strategic ambiguity or not having strategic ambiguity. So when it comes to proposition first, you have to, one, tell me what your model looks like, which means that sure, we understand, firstly give me like a rough understanding of what strategic ambiguity is, but you have to also tell me what a world without strategic ambiguity would look like, which means that you would be like trading with certain international countries during certain problems, or like having a direct stance, but also like condemning countries during political problems, or like actively engaging or taking sides during trade wars and things like that. So having a stance specifically and actually taking sides is something that basically should be pushed out through your model. But I understand that a proposition is a little harder to push for or to ground in reality, but the way that you do this is to contextualize it in a strategic way. One, by telling me that India is a growing superpower, which means that they have a high level of resources already. So they have a lot of they're resource rich basically, right? But secondly, tell me that the non-aligned movement originally started because India was quite decrepit in terms of the economy. So this is no longer the case now, and they're probably not going to be affected by external factors any longer. You have to tell me reasons for this. One, maybe tell me that they are quite self-sufficient at this point of time, especially in terms of them having higher number of technology, medicine, food, and things like that. So they have improved in terms of self-sufficiency to a great extent. But secondly, tell me that they also have more deterrence now, or for things like they do have nukes, or nuclear power and things like that, which are generally considered a big part of are very important in terms of maneuvering global dominance or having in between relations internationally. But thirdly, you have to also tell me that there is a shift in national interest now from rather moving away from improving the economy because it's already being improved, rather to be gaining regional dominance. The way that you can prove this is to say that this is why India has been vying for that seat in the UNSC, but have still not gotten it. So you can see that there's a clear movement towards trying to get regional dominance. Okay, so basically in proposition, you have to prove to me that abandoning strategic ambiguity will probably create more influence and possibly some sort of economic benefit. So if you move on into arguments now, the first argument, or one argument that you can make, is this idea of how you will be able to gain power. So firstly, in terms of stronger allies, here there's a couple of ways that you can go about this. One, in terms of allies that you already have, and this looks like certain countries, maybe it's Russia, maybe it's China, whatever. All of these relations are now becoming more fragile at the point at which India is ambiguous, which means that there is a constant need for direct reliability, which India doesn't have at the point at which they're ambiguous and no longer take an active stance in certain issues. So uniquely, you're probably going to have stronger allies because you can strengthen already pre-existing allies that you have. But secondly, because India now becomes a more reliable individual, because because they're actively taking stances in certain things, you're more likely to have more allies. Because you can argue that the reason why they don't have as many allies, or they do that certain allies aren't as strong with them, is because of the fact that India is uncertain in taking your side. So because of that, people try not to rely too much on India. So at the point at which they do take stances, countries know that India is someone that they can rely on, especially when it comes to issues in the UN and things like that. But this benefit is reciprocated, which means that India will now get more allies in terms of international crisis that India is a part of, which means that maybe it's like issues with Pakistan, or maybe it's like issues in Jammu Kashmir. So all of these international issues, you're probably going to have more allies because you are willing to take a stance and willing to support people, support other countries. So you are more likely to have more allies that are not ambiguous with you either. So this is really important for India, especially given like the current context when there is a lot of like possibly international issues and things like that. So that's how you can argue about allies. But secondly, in terms of gaining sort of like power in the area, which means that now even though India exists, they lack a sort of push in terms of having power themselves, which means there's anyway growing Western dominance and things like that. And the only way that you can create leverage or like have any form of leverage as a country is when you start taking active stances and create that sort of reliability within you. Which means that you're also at the point at which you start taking stances or start like condemning countries for actions that you don't agree with, you're more likely to get that UNSC seat or get a more powerful position in maybe the UN or maybe even like regionally, and where people are more likely to rely on you as opposed to relying on like Western countries or like China's influence, because of the fact that you are a more relatable country that's in the middle of Asia and is a country that is growing, who has like, you know, gone through the sort of same issues that other countries them have also faced. So you have like at the point at which you stop being ambiguous, you have more say in certain things and more leverage in like global issues than you would have now, at the point at which you are more likely to get the UNSCC, but also you have more allies that can now push you towards or allow you to maybe even take control or push policies the way that you want to, especially if you can influence, even if you can't influence larger countries, you can influence smaller countries to do or to have policies in the way that you want at the point at which you start taking stances. The way that you push this argument is to tell me uniquely that this cannot exist at the point at which you are strategically ambiguous, and power cannot be achieved when you no longer take a stance. Understand that there is no point in having nuclear weapons if you are going to be volatile in the way that you use or the way that you portray that power. So and because you have things like nukes where you do have some form of deterrence or leverage, and that leverage can only be actualized at the point at which you stop being ambiguous. But second idea was this idea of like economically how this would benefit. So here you can have arguments about how more allies means more trade and probably more reliance on like Indian goods, because they know that they are someone that is now more dependable. But I think the strongest line for proposition to win is to argue that you have more power and this is in the best interest of India anyway. But you can also sort of say that economically both sides may benefit, but at the point at which you have strong allies, they're more likely to rely on you for certain goods as opposed to not being ambiguous even in terms of trade. Secondly, in terms of opposition, one, you have to characterize this in terms of them being a growing economy, which means that they're at a very sensitive point of time in international relations where any sort of decision will directly affect their growth. And because they're still not on par of like bargaining abilities with like countries like USA or China, definitely. But secondly, you have to characterize it in terms of taking sides as being very difficult in conflicts, because even when it comes to like Russia and Ukraine war, it's not even if you condemn Russia, it also means that you're going to sort of ruin your relationships, especially when it comes to like BRICS countries and things like that. So taking a side is very difficult in general anyway. Then you have to obviously tell me what your model would look like, what being ambiguous would look like, especially in like today's climate, and how it'll probably where maybe you want to focus on things like internal issues or developing your country better, or that is one of your more important interests, as opposed to like your global dominance interests. Okay, so what would your arguments then be? One, you can make argument on like the economic benefits that you would achieve. So in terms of how you can engage with trade in either side because it doesn't affect you, and how there's anyway going to be a reliance on you for trade because people know that you're not going to ever be involved with like big issues, so therefore you're probably an easier person to deal with. But secondly, you can also argue about how at the point at which you start becoming ambiguous, you're gonna start losing trade. And here is where you say there is anyway like you would lose certain individuals, especially strong, powerful countries that you would maybe condemn, who are very big parts or trading partners, and losing them would mean that you lose the trend of your economic growth. And this is bad because at this point in time you're not powerful enough yet. So you don't want to take the risk of losing important economic stakeholders and sort of affect the sort of regional power that you are naturally accumulating now in anyway. But secondly, in terms of the power that you're creating is never going to be created with at the point at which you're no longer ambiguous. One, in terms of how people wouldn't even, maybe like they won't even get this power anyway, because even if they like start taking stances, you're like, it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone is going to rely on you, given that there are stronger like allies like maybe the Western dominated countries, or maybe like China or Russia or whatever. So maybe India is probably not going to be any country's first resort anyway. But secondly, you can also argue about how things like sanctions, or how the moment you take a stance, how the country is going to be directly affected in other ways. Maybe you're going to lose economically through sanctions. Maybe you're going to lose like people that would have otherwise, taken your side in international issues. You're possibly, and also understand, and here is where that context of choosing sides being difficult is going to come in, where you argue that having other countries like getting involved or actively taking a stance is difficult, especially if you have very powerful relations with one country, but they are the ones that are having human rights violations. So then at that point you are like torn between having to choose your trade partner versus having to stand up for your morals. So given this sort of climate, you're probably going to have to be directly affected far badly in terms of like sanctions and things like that. But thirdly, you can also argue that power within your country, especially when you anyway have like international or like local issues like divisions in like states and things like that, where there are issues, maybe there's like internal issues, like concentrating on that and spending more time on fixing those issues and fixing the sort of system, and like maybe it's things like rural education, maybe it's things like the health sector or anything. Focusing on those things and spending more money and time on those is something that is more in your best interest, because you're, at the end of the day, your biggest priority is your people and not how other people or other countries act outside of your country. So you wouldn't want, or it is not in your best interest, because it will never, particularly if it doesn't affect your people, then it's not something that India needs to act on. So opposition's line is, one, saying that power wouldn't be accumulated, but also probably will your current situation will get worse. Secondly, in terms of how economically you're going to probably be worse off at the point of which is a very sensitive point of time for India. So ideally, how proposition and oppositions, the main clash would be what is more important, gaining power, or is it in terms of improving the country economically? So those sort of clashes will end up becoming the most important things in this debate. So I hope that helped you guys out, and stay tuned for more debrief videos.